and Made of Silk and Steel by All Marvel No Get Off My Sheets. Chapter 12. The inside of Peter's skull ached. His nose had started bleeding almost an hour ago, though he didn't know that it was an hour. 2 sleeps ago was his only measurement. He has lost count of how many times his vision has been forced to slow down and then speed up again. He has lost count of how many people he has now helped Edward to kill. Peter was scared. He was scared because even if he wasn't killing them himself, he knew that he was the one responsible for a great number of these deaths. He was scared because they kept sending men, and he and Ed kept getting shot at. He was scared because even if his parents didn't have Ed's skills or his powers, he was still a 7-year-old boy who desperately wanted his mom and dad's protection. He was scared because any time they were not fighting for their lives, Peter couldn't seem to make himself stay awake anymore, and now his nose was bleeding, a slow, steady drip that flowed down his chin. For a little while, he made an attempt to wipe it off on his shirt, but soon had to write that off as a lost cause. He knew that Ed would take care of him, but he was worried. Peter had used his powers more in this one day than he ever had in the rest of his entire life combined. As cool as Ned thought it was to have superpowers, Peter didn't think that using them this way was very good for him. Peter was starting to think that maybe his powers were starting to kill him. He was forced awake and gasping by another pulse of pain at the base of his spine, jerking him awake from his place where Peter clung to Edward's back. "You're all right, Petya," Ed told him. Over his shoulder and through his blurry vision, Peter could see a body laying on the ground, with the handle of a knife sticking from its side. Ed had run out of bullets for his own gun just before the sun went down and had resorted to his fists or whatever was closest to hand. It hadn't slowed him down a whole lot, though. That middle arm really was no joke. At least Peter was really good at holding on to things, because Edward was adamant that he wouldn't set him down or leave him anywhere, and having both of his hands free had become pretty important recently. Now if only they would stop sending people to shoot at them, or Peter wished that until they sent him in. "Hey Cap," Clint called. "Tony, we got a hit here." Both men glanced over at the hollow displays where Clint and Natasha were standing. Natasha looked over her shoulder. "Got a lot of 911 dispatches about repeated shots fired in the southern section of the Hudson's Yards," she drawled. "So we started checking the CCTV cameras in the area. And it's just like Castle said," Clint said, unusually somber. "It looks like the Sarge really does think the kid is his master." A quick look at the video was a vivid illustration of this. Barnes and the kid were standing between 2 broken chain link fences. They were unmoving for long enough that, for a moment, they thought it was a simple still photograph before Peter, riding the Winter Soldier piggyback, pointed to the left and then held up 4 fingers. The kid was not looking too good, blood from his nose running down his face and weepy-eyed. He nevertheless held on to Bucky, with both small legs around his waist and both hands clutching his jacket. Bucky nodded, and sure enough, there were suddenly 4 people coming in from around the corner of the warehouse, behind the fencing on the left side, and it looked like the soldier was now short a long-range weapon. "I want exact GPS location data on them," Steve barked, gesturing for the team to move. "They're practically in our backyard. Let's give them some backup." Matt knew that returning to the city was the most sensible plan, by his own admission. He couldn't just conjure Peter up out of thin air, no matter how much he wished he could. But Matt also couldn't help the growing feeling that was building in the back of his mind, the feeling that if he did manage to locate his son, he'd be finding nothing more than his corpse. The first 24 hours after abduction were the most critical. He knew that Jessica was also well aware of this. After those 24 hours, the odds of ever recovering a missing child were very small, superpowers or not, and the odds of that child still being alive were even slimmer still. Salinger had held on to Peter for just under that amount of time. How long had Castle managed to hold on to him before the man with the metal arm had intervened? And what the hell had he done with Castle? He and Frank Castle disagreed on a lot of things, but if Karen had charged him with Peter's safety and well-being, then Matt had every faith that he'd carry that mission out, unless he was dead or had been captured. The last thing he wanted to do was have to tell Karen that Frank had died protecting him, a task which she herself had entrusted to him. And he knew that all of these things were probably already running through Jessica's mind. Finding people was part of her job. She knew all of the gruesome agonies of the odds on recovering a victim of kidnapping. The stresses of the past few days sat heavy in his stomach as they crossed from New Jersey back into New York, finally returning to Manhattan after their fruitless searching. And then, after all the hopelessness and the terror, Matt finally heard it, like a hallucination, like a dream. Like a miracle. "Trish, stop the car." He didn't feel dangerous. Later, that will be the most terrifying part for Peter, standing there mere feet away from them. He was not ringing an alarm bell in the tingle that warned him of potential danger. Maybe a vague buzz, but nothing like the men shooting at them with guns or, God forbid, Salinger. The boy was standing there, dressed in 2 large clothes, with no weapons in his hands. He was older and bigger than Peter, 12 maybe? But he was still neither very old nor very large for his age. He had white blonde hair that hung onto his face and large sad blue eyes, and nothing about him felt dangerous until he opened his mouth and something horrible came out of it. "Zelani," he whispered, and it was like being kicked in the teeth, a sharp pain that erupted all over his face, and it was blood coating the inside of his mouth, hot and coppery and too thick. "Razhive." And each word sent a pulse of pain and fear that Peter associated with incoming danger, and each word made it scream louder, louder, louder. "Semnatsa." He was ashamed to say that it took him until the 3rd word for Peter to realize that there was something wrong with Ed. He was shaking all over. "Razvit." "No, no," Edward moaned, "no." "Pick." And Peter wanted to go and stop the boy from saying these things, these horrible words that were making Edward tremble with terror and cry, but he was afraid. He was worried about leaving Ed all by himself. "Devat." "I want to stay," Ed cried, and he was begging, pleading. "The Projdeviet." "I don't want to leave again," he pleaded, "and he's taking me away. I don't want to leave you, Petya." And he was begging Peter. Frantically, Peter covered Ed's ears and began screaming at the top of his voice, "Stay, stay, stay, stay." He could see the boy's lips moving, mouth forming more words, could feel the way that movement resonated in the throbbing pain that consumed his whole skull. But he couldn't hear them, and he hoped, he prayed, that meant that it wouldn't count. And then Ed surged forward. The boy was bigger and older than him, but he was still not really old or big, and the metal hand looked enormous around his neck that way. "Go to sleep," Edward hissed, the first time that Peter had ever heard him really, truly angry, and the boy's wide blue eyes grew impossibly wider with fear as Ed shook him. Spat. Peter watched, heart in his throat, as Ed slowly choked him into unconsciousness, before dumping his body back to the ground and running the other way with shaky breaths and trembling limbs. Above them, a Quinjet flew overhead, and Ed muttered something unhappy in Russian, quickly ducking into the nearest building. Peter's senses pulsed a new warning of incoming danger. "A lot," he whispered, heart sinking. "Ed, there's a lot." They had already, with Peter's sense and Ed's hands, taken down a small army in just a few handfuls at a time. This would be a small army all at once. Up, Ed said in a grunt, putting a hand beneath his butt and pushing him toward the high ceilings above the section of metal walkways. Peter caught sight of the vent grating over their heads. Petya up. Obediently, Peter yanked the grate off, letting it hang drunkenly from the hinges and crawling inside, coughing at the dust interior as he settled himself inside. Satisfied that he was securely hidden, Ed hammered the grating back in place with his metal fist. Sternly, he pointed one shiny finger at Peter and said, "Petya, stay." Dizzy and gushing more blood from his nose, Peter whispered, "Okay, Ed." Then they went right back to gunfire. Ed was doing well, so well, all things considered. But Peter knew that he had to be tired already, and he heard a droning sound like another aircraft landing somewhere nearby, and people screaming. He covered his mouth to stifle a scream of alarm as the entire building rocked and shuddered around them. And then Peter heard the sound of bricks crumbling and sliding over each other. Had they blown up one of the outer walls? Peter hadn't heard an explosion, but there were so many things happening at once that with his limited view beneath him, it was overwhelming. He heard a voice from the southern side of the building say, that's the kidnapper, isn't it? I don't see him in here. A voice more grim than he'd ever remembered hearing it, but still familiar and welcome, replied, "Oh, he's here. Dad? Barton, I want you tagging anyone who approaches Bucky and the kid too closely. He's down to using knives or his fists, and the more people he's forced to fight, the more it puts the boy at risk. Start. Keep an eye on the area cameras. We don't want to lose track of them before we get there. Doc, stand by. Peter's obviously in need of medical attention, and Bucky probably will be too. Romanoff needs you and Stark to keep your heads," Natasha said evenly. "Natasha," Steve sighed. "No, Natasha," she mocked. "Cap, I know that he's your friend, but we don't want him to hurt himself or Peter by accident, and he's definitely not in his right mind. Stark, I know that you love the kid already, but he has parents, and they are angry, and neither of them are going to appreciate you getting possessive with their son. So just cool it, okay?" "Hey, I don't mean to interrupt," Bruce said hesitantly, "but this seems bad." Tony's head turned toward the camera feed, eyes widening. "Darling cupcake, what an extraordinary gift you have for understatement." Clint glanced from Steve to the camera. Doesn't he? Well, that kind of looks like you, Cap, from before." Besides Steve, he watched Natasha's hands spasm on the strap of her gear kit. With a more direct glance in her direction, he said, "Romanoff?" Schooling her expression back into serenity, Natasha said, "Seems like Castle isn't the only one who managed to figure out who Barnes views as his new master." She gave him the ghost of a smile, her attempt to be reassuring. "I'd assume they're trying to see if they can supplant Peter's control over him using a Steve Rogers lookalike." The team watched the cameras as Bucky, to their shock, began crying and shaking his head at whatever the mock Steve said, until Peter held both hands over his ears and began shouting over the sound of the other child speaking. "Trigger words," Tony mouthed in horror. Natasha caught his eye and nodded. "It didn't work," Steve said, relieved, as they watched Bucky knock the young Steve lookalike unconscious with speed and prejudice. The appearance of the Quinjet alerted them that their presence was needed sooner rather than later. "All right, you heard Cap," Tony called. "Places, people, it's showtime." "Are you sure?" Trish said hesitantly as the car rolled to a stop outside the series of old warehouses on the south side of the Hudson Yards. "Trish, shut up," Jess said shortly, and Matt was grateful, both for the show of faith in him, and also because he was trying to freaking concentrate over here. There's a shitload of men in there, Jessica. They're armed, he said out loud, and right on cue, they heard gunfire. Confused, Matt said, they're trying to subdue the kidnapper? What do you mean? Jessica demanded. Why do you sound unhappy about that? They want Peter. They keep calling the man the asset, and they want to take Peter too. Jess, I think they sent him, he said angrily. And now he's refusing to obey orders and turn Peter in. Stand back, Jess barked. Why? Trish asked, alarmed. I'm making us a door. Pausing to orient himself more for a moment, Matt pointed to a section of the wall and said, here. A solid punch in the spot he picked out collapsed an entire section and revealed to Jess and Trish the absolute chaos Matt must have been sensing within. The robot man fighting squads of men in full riot gear across a series of metal walkways running the length of the room. Trish knocked out 2 as Jess took out 2 more, and Matt pushed a 5th one down the stairs, scanning the room since she had better low light vision than Jessica, and this building probably hadn't had functioning electricity in years. Trish said, that's the kidnapper, isn't it? I don't see him in here. Beneath the shifting dust of a disused building, the fierce sweat of dozens of men and brick rubble, Matt could smell fresh blood in the air, his own blood spilling out into open space, and a tripping heartbeat, small and fluttering somewhere overhead. Grimly, Matt promised, oh, he's here. As if this fight wasn't strange enough, the kidnapper spotted the 3 of them and paused for a moment, mid-punch in surprise. Ta mama Petya. Now none of them actually spoke a word of Russian or any Eastern European language for that matter, but Mama was pretty freaking universal. Peter's mom. Do we know him? Trish asked curiously, pushing one man into another. She glanced over at her sister. He's pretty cute. I did not hear you just call my son's kidnapper cute, Jess said flatly, carelessly tossing someone down to the lower level. I'm still not seeing him. If Jessica could see Matt's eyes, she had the feeling he would be rolling them. We've got company, ladies. Bad company? Trish asked, then rolled her own eyes at herself. Of course, what other kind is there? Interesting company, Matt allowed. Peter, Jessica barked. Back to Peter. Matt dodged the fists of another pair of men. One had something that looked like pepper spray and smelled even worse, and since he did not want him discharging that, Matt swung into a kick that hit him straight in the jaw. Not really conscious. What? Maybe I've changed my mind, Tony murmured, as the 5 of them watched Murdoch and Jones through the giant hole Jones had just freaking punched into the building. Murdoch, in the man in black Daredevil outfit, pushed 3 men directly toward Jones, who threw each of them out of one of the broken windows like she was taking out the trash. Maybe I do want them on the team. In that outfit? Bruce asked, in a rare show of humor. Tony grimaced. Minor details. I have got to get that guy some real body armor before he gets himself shot in the head. He can probably hear you, Natasha reminded him almost cheerfully. There was blood all over Murdoch's teeth, an indication he'd probably already been injured when he and Jones started shaking down this group of dipshits. But he didn't give away any clues that he was listening to their conversation. Then again, he probably had a lot of practice pretending not to hear things that he actually did hear. From here? Bruce asked. 4 blocks radius, Tony murmured, glancing at Natasha. The world was coming apart and reforming over and over again, and Peter, laying half-conscious in the ventilation duct between the 1st and 2nd floors, felt each and every moment of it. The bricks of the building shifted, but they were shifting against his skin. Even one floor below him, his parents spoke. How did they get here? And he wasn't always awake enough to hear them, but their voices were directly in his ear when he was. Moisture dripped down the walls in the abandoned rooms, and Peter could practically taste it on his tongue. He squeezed his eyes closed, moaning senselessly in agony. His head felt like someone was trying to claw their way in from the outside, a sharp stabbing pain that was remaking him along with the entire world. Below him, he hallucinated a frenzied and furious daredevil, practically ripping through the small army trying to fight their way into the building. "You will give me back my son," he snarled low and rough with rage before throwing one over the rails. In his delirious state, Peter thought of that small preteen blonde boy with the sad blue eyes. Oh no, was that the devil's child? Had he and Ed actually attacked Daredevil's son? At one point, he managed to get his eyes open because even though his danger sense hadn't gone off, Peter had the sudden feeling that Ed was in trouble. And when he did force his eyes open, he inhaled sharply with surprise. That was his mom, held Edward by the hair and was forcing his torso over the railing at a painfully awkward angle, somehow forcing his metal arm to bend behind his back with the other hand. "You took him," she growled, pushing harder and making him whimper in pain. "You took him, and I want to know what the fuck you did with him, asshole." A figure all dressed in black stepped in beside her, one that Peter had only ever seen in grainy newspaper photos or that time in his weird vision. And nearly as strange as watching Mom be able to hold Edward down practically with one hand was seeing him touch her gently on the shoulder. Daredevil murmured, "Jessica, what?" Mom snarled irritably. Daredevil tilted his head back, right where Peter's vent grate was, and pointed directly at his hiding spot. Immediately, the two of them gazed upward. Peter let out a soundless gasp, immediately covering his mouth. "Peter," Daredevil beckoned in a hoarse croak, and again there was blood in his teeth. His mouth was bruised, and there was a slowly dripping cut down the side of his neck. Something about the sound of his voice made Peter want to burst into tears. Maybe it was the way he said Peter's name, like he was someone really, really important to him. "I thought you said he wasn't really awake," Mom said, immediately shoving Edward away to stand beside him. Daredevil shook his head before reaching up and pulling the black mask away from the top of his face. His dark eyes stared sightlessly up at Peter and into the heavens, head still tilted in that way it did when his father was concentrating on something. "Peter," Dad coaxed softly, shoving the mask into the pockets of his pants. One of those large, roughened hands that he'd come to know and love so well beckoned him downward. "It's safe now. We're here, baby. Everything's all right, Peter." End of chapter.